Hey, welcome. I'm Wally Husband. I teach international relations here at the University of Alabama. And I'm so excited to be able to host this conference on Andor and politics of Star Wars. This is our second night, our second day. Yesterday, we had a screening of 2 episodes of Andor, which was really, a great experience to have on this big screen here at the University of Alabama. We have a full day of presentations, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker, our keynote speaker. Patrick Thaddeus Jackson, who is a professor of international studies and chair of the Department of Global Inquiry and in the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C. He's written extensively on the philosophy of social science, the idea of the West, and the politics of popular culture about Star Wars and other features. He also regularly dresses in full Jedi robes to class on Halloween, as they did yesterday, of course. So we're so excited to have Patrick give us this, I think, preview of his forthcoming book on Star Wars. So I'm excited. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Ollie, and to everybody at the University of Alabama for making this possible. I think I mentioned to a couple of people beforehand. This is a little bit of like wish fulfillment for 5-year-old me. So again, my parents swear they took me to see Snow White when it first went out, not first out there, but when it was out in theaters. I don't remember that. But what I remember is I remember sitting in my parents' car at a drive-in in California watching the original Star Wars when it first came out. And my parents said that was the first time I ever shut up for 2 hours in my life, because I just kind of sat there. Like every single thing I did in kindergarten from then on was a reference to the Darth Vader Obi-Wan lightsaber fight. Yeah, so this has been something that the part of my brain has always kind of lived in the Star Wars galaxy. Ever since that moment. So the opportunity to come and actually talk about this in an academic setting is as much wish fulfillment as the panel we did at the International Studies Association back in 2016, but we all showed up faster. That was cool too. But today I don't want to talk about that. Today what I want to talk about is I want to give a little bit of an overview of, and as Waleed said, this is also kind of an introduction to or overview of the book that I'm presently working on, which is called Balance, of course, and is a particular way of thinking about the Star Wars saga and situating it within studies of popular culture, but also, as you'll see, situating it within a broad sort of social dynamic of what I'm going to call engagements with disenchantment. So I think in order to really understand what's going on in something like Star Wars, we have to understand the way that it portrays itself, presents itself as myth. And I mean something very particular by that, so I want to develop that a little bit. Fair warning up front, by talking about Star Wars as contemporary myth, I do not mean to repeat the hackneyed notion that Lucas based Star Wars on his reading of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is factually inaccurate, because as far as we know, Lucas didn't actually read Campbell until around the time The Empire Strikes Back. And Star Wars doesn't actually follow the exact thing that Campbell lays out. And what biographers have generally argued is that where Lucas mostly got this stuff from was from reading comic books and pulp novels. So there is an awful lot of intertextual popular culture engagement that comes into here. So when I say myth, that's not what I mean. I mean something else about Disenchantment, and we will get to that. Every good Star Wars film starts with a nice opening crawl. Start with a nice opening crawl. I'm going to, because 3 is a sacred number in Western culture, develop 3 points. I'm going to spend more time on the first 2 because I figure the third one is one we're going to be talking about for most of the conference. So the first point that I want to elaborate on a little bit is that in order to talk about the politics of Star Wars, we have to take seriously what Star Wars says as a text. That it's not simply that we're going to grab pieces of it and look for parallels with politics. We're actually trying to get a sense of what the overall presentation of the Star Wars itself is. So what is the voice that is speaking in this text? There's sort of implied author if we want to do really literary study about it, which I think is the correct way to approach these things. The second point I want to develop is my more sociological and socio-historical thing about the need to regard Star Wars as a particular kind of literary genre, and in particular as a genre that I will call myth. It is a way of disclosing a world that is not a disenchanted world of pure fact and value neutral science, but it is a disclosure of a world that is, in a very important sense, magical, meaning that there is intrinsic moral ontology that is built into the world that is disclosed. This becomes very important when trying to think about Andor, and we'll talk a little bit about why Andor is sort of pushing the boundaries of that as far as you can in terms of staying within this Star Wars kind of magical world that is disclosed by the narrative. And then the third point, which is the second half of the book, is where I'm going to argue that the way Star Wars, the sort of politics of Star Wars have to be understood in terms of the context it's speaking into. The context is very much an American product and is speaking into a foreign policy and global imperial kind of context in which the United States, since before there was a United States, has always been animated by this notion of manifest destiny, this notion of chosenness, this idea that the role of the United States is to go forth into the world and impose by force if necessary, or sometimes by force as we elect to, impose its vision upon things, and it's doing so for kind of transcendental purposes, fulfilling some kind of divine mission. I'm going to argue that Star Wars is a critique of chosen one exceptionalisms, mostly because everybody who shows up as a chosen one on screen or in novels in Star Wars turns out to be A, a bad guy, and B, the narrative comes and smacks him in the ass in the end. So this is important, right? This is a critique of, beyond any kind of particular sort of allegorical parallels of things that happen in Star Wars to real world events, there's a way in which the universe as a whole, world disclosed as a whole, is a particular kind of engagement with what I will also suggest is the magical world of US foreign policy and manifest destiny, which purports to be disclosing the same kind of world with a moral ontology that justifies the sort of awful things the United States gets up to in the world. Again, I'm going to spend less time on that because I think we're going to talk about that a lot in the course of today, but I want to spend a little bit of time on the first year just by giving a bit of an overview, a bit of a sort of conceptual mapping, because I am, contractually obligated to produce 2x2 tables in everything that I do. This is a requirement, where the requirement came from, but it is a requirement. I find it very useful, as Charles Tilly used to say, a 2x2 is interesting enough to give you some good conceptual variation and simple enough that you can remember what the axes are. So I find it a useful kind of first cut way to do this. There are a bunch of different ways one can approach popular culture. And within international studies, there are at least these 4 different kinds of approaches that you can see going on in these things. Different fields, different disciplines will sort of come in at different points into this. So I want to do a quick conceptual mapping of the kind of approaches to pop cultural artifacts like Star Wars one might select, and then do that by way of locating the kind of approach I'm going to take in the rest. So on the top axis, what we have is a question about how the popular culture artifact is going to be used in the course of the argument. Is it going to be used as data? Are we interested in studying the artifact because it tells us something about something broader? Or are we interested in studying the artifact because we think it's an element in a process that we're actually trying to get our hands around? So again, rough distinction here, and obviously these are ideal types. Actual work sometimes combines these things, but conceptually, I think it's useful to think about this sort of dichotomy. The other dichotomy, the type of explanation, is one that builds on a lot of the work I've done in philosophy of social science and modes of explanation in the social sciences. And if we have we're trying to do a causal explanation of something, right? Trying to give some set of instructions for how one makes certain sorts of outcomes happen or not happen, which is the basic argument, I think, of the last book that I did, causal explanation works. If we're interested in that, and we're using pop culture or pop cultural artifacts as a piece of data, I would argue that what you're doing in that case is we're using the artifact as a product. We're interested in why it looks the way that it does, and what that analysis tells us about the broader political economy or distribution system or capitalist market that it is embedded in. But we're really interested in those broader things. So we use the artifact as sort of a lens to get into it. So here's where you get a lot of political economy or popular culture kind of work. Here's where you get things where we'll take an artifact and we'll say, okay, so what does this tell us about the publishing industry? What does this tell us about intellectual property regimes? What does this tell us about global media networks? Things like that. So we're interested in these bigger things. We use the artifact as a way into those bigger things. If we're interested in treating popular culture as an artifact as an element in a process, but we're doing a causal explanation, I would suggest mostly what we're doing there is we're doing a kind of contribution analysis. What does this thing contribute to the generation of the causation of some outcome? Then you can have your sort of psychological pathway for doing so. People watch, consume, read some pop cultural artifact, then that changes their attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, whatever, and then they act differently. You can also have the more kind of sociological rhetorical deployment causal mechanism. So it doesn't matter whether people believe it. What matters is things are distributed. They become resources that can be mobilized. That mobilization legitimates certain kinds of outcomes rather than others. So shades into more social movement organizing work. There's been some, I haven't seen good scholarly work on this, but certainly some kind of anecdotal work on, or anecdotal observations of the way Star Wars symbols show up in popular protest. And I think a lot of that work would fit into here, right? In terms of what our contribution is being made. Interestingly and importantly, if you're in the causal line, what the artifact says on its own terms is not really what matters. What matters, if you're doing the contribution thing, is what people take it to mean and how they use it. And if you're doing product, it's not really what it says, it's sort of how it's composed, how it's actually put together, production decisions and economic decisions. So if we drop down to the bottom of the 2x2 and we say we're going to be generating more of an interpretive explanation, so we're going to be talking more about meaning and rules and the kind of language game that is going on in a particular popular cultural artifact, now we have to be concerned about what the artifact says on its own terms. And if we're using that as data, I would suggest that what we're doing there is a kind of analysis that I'm going to call exemplar, in which we take a particular pop cultural artifact and we say, this is popular, this is being used, this becomes a proxy for the kinds of things people are thinking. Or as a really interesting paper by a former student of mine, Jesse Crane-Sieber, at the International Studies Association meeting a month or so ago, was arguing that if we look at something like Andor, we get a good understanding of the limits of our ability to imagine revolution. And we say, okay, so this tells us something about this, and why are there still traditional gender codes being utilized all over the place here? Why isn't that like a topic? So that is not a way of saying something wrong with Andor, but saying so that the way Andor is composed tells us something about this broader set of cultural meanings. And that would be, again, a way, since it's data, using the artifact as a lens into something else. Right. If one was a more positivistically inclined scholar, one might say that using pop culture as an exemplar is a cheap way of doing a lot of focus groups. I don't think that's actually accurate, but there's a lot of things go into why films become popular. But certainly you can index like broad social thought about things by looking at top ranked movies and by attendance and so on and say, okay, was this telling us something about these broader things? The place I want to locate what I want to talk about for the rest of this time is in this fourth box, in which what we're interested in is using the artifact as an element, right, as an element in a process, but not as an element in a causal process. I want to argue that Star Wars does certain things. What I do want to argue is that Star Wars says certain things about it. And so in order to do this is an interpretive account of what it is that Star Wars is actually saying. And I'm interested in it on its own terms. And I will go to the map to defend the proposition that if we are engaging with works of popular culture, it is incumbent on us, regardless of which of these things we end up doing, to start with some kind of a demonstrably valid reconstruction of the rules of the fictional world that are actually being exemplified in the artifact itself. Otherwise, you get what I would consider the kind of manifest absurdity of strategic debates about military strategy during The Lord of the Rings that sort of treat the question of whether you bring the ring to Gondor or not as if that was some sort of a strategic decision. It's not. The ring is evil. You can't bring the ring to Gondor. That's a bad thing. Or the kind of stuff you get in the sort of absurd uses of Thucydides, very close international relations for a second. This idea that like, okay, there's such a thing as a Thucydides trap and Thucydides was somehow articulated. It's bullshit. Thucydides was writing a Greek tragedy in which the whole point is that Athens gets more and more hubristic and then falls. And if you detach just the moment, or what IR scholars like to do, you detach the Melian dialogue from all of that and say, oh, expressing like, fundamental truths about reality. No, he's not. He's using the Melian dialogue as a way of illustrating how far the Athenians have fallen away from any kind of defensible notion of being like a moral actor in politics. And then the consequences of this that happen once they do so. So I think detaching these things and but without sort of starting off with just like basically reconstructing the way that the particular world works is a bit of a problem. Something we have to work. In fact, when make this a little bit more concrete, it's a trap. There are certain traps to avoid, if we're trying, especially if we're trying to talk about what a particular source says, right? The first trap, I think, is allegory, which is very easy for us to fall into. We can look at an event depicted on screen and say, oh, the conflict at the end of Return of the Jedi is actually an allegory for the Vietnam War. Okay, maybe. I mean, there's some evidence that Lucas was kind of thinking about that, but there's also evidence that Lucas was thinking about a whole bunch of other things. And clearly, when the text is produced, it's not locked down specifically to the historical event that it might, even for the producers, have exemplified at the time. So I side with Tolkien on this and have a cordial dislike of allegory when it comes to these things. So I think it's easy for us to say, all too easy for us to say, particularly in the kind of commentariat class type op-eds, oh, this is a representation of some real political event. I think that's a little bit too soon. I think that we also can sometimes, especially and scholars do sometimes fall into the trap of taking a particular fictional artifact and using it to exemplify our favorite theory. And saying, oh, this is clearly a demonstration of prospect theory. Clearly, this is about, the undecidability of language. And we just got to read our own stuff kind of into it. All right. Pedagogically, I think this can be very helpful. Trying to get a concept across to students. I mentioned a popular cultural reference that they know. Asterisk, make sure they actually understand the popular reference. One of the signs of me getting old is that I realized at a certain point that I could no longer explain liberalism by looking at my students and saying supreme executive power derives from mandate for the masses and some farcical and public ceremony, because I hadn't watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This immediately led to Monty Python and the Holy Grail being placed on the syllabus. But the point is, you have to, if you're trying to communicate, you got to make sure that they're actually involved in understanding what the popular reference is. And if we are doing something like that, again, we've got to be careful that we're not ripping things completely out of context. Or if we are, we say explicitly, you know what? Yeah, I understand that like the Empire's strategy on Hoth was not really about defeating the rebels, but about Vader trying to capture Luke Skywalker, which explains some of the interesting tactically unsound decisions that the Empire makes when trying to conduct their assault. But footnote, I'm just going to ignore that because I'm really interested in the battlefield question. Okay, fine, that's enough. You've now acknowledged that you're pulling it out for a particular purpose. I also think we've got to be very careful not to confuse what the text says with what characters say, because of course characters can say things that the narrative does not actually want you to believe or adhere to. Palpatine says all kinds of stuff when trying to seduce Anakin, and one should not treat those as if that was somehow Star Wars' message, the way it is currently done in certain rather right-leaning corners of the internet, which say, oh, this is all about the glorification of power for power's sake, and that's really what Star Wars is about. Like, did you not watch this? When the White House is treating pictures of TIE fighters, I'm like, they're the bad guys. Like, you understand what you're doing here. These are the bad guys, very, very clearly. So we have to be very careful. What I think we have to focus on instead is we have to focus on the kind of world building that goes into the fictional artifact, and we focus on the overall plot, how things turn out, the broader context. And if we do that, and we start thinking about the character of the world that Star Wars builds, and the kind of plot-driven message that it gives in terms of what the fate of different characters and initiatives are, I think in order to understand this is where I would transition to my second point. We have to understand what Star Wars is ultimately up to, and why Star Wars is not actually science fiction, in my estimation, is because Star Wars is not disclosing a disenchanted world of facts and science. Star Wars is in some ways profoundly anti-technology. It's very much about disclosing a world of inherent moral meaning, right? The Force is not just, as Rey says at one point in Last Jedi, a power Jedi have that allowed them to move rocks around. Like, that's not actually what the Force is for. And the thing about Last Jedi is that, like, Rian Johnson actually understood that. So he has Luke actually being able to give speeches about like what the sort of theology of the Force is, which is fantastic. Why is this important as a sort of genre question? Why this is important as a genre question is because of what Max Weber, I thought about trying to give him, some sort of rebel thing, but no, that would be a little too stoic with that. What Weber called the disenchantment of the world. And I think the disenchantment of the world, properly understood, is the backdrop against which, or in reaction to which, popular cultural artifacts, at least since the middle of the 19th century in the Euro-American world, are all reactive to, right? They're all engaging disenchantment in one way or another. Now, when I say they're engaging disenchantment, I don't mean they're engaging secularism, which is what it often gets conflated with, and I think that's a poor reading of what Weber is actually talking about. The word that comes out as disenchant in the German is actually Entsalbung, which literally means the demagikification. And so Weber's actual argument in a number of places, it's interesting because Weber, this is one of those concepts that Weber comes up with at the end of his life, and so it's not actually woven through a lot of his oeuvre. There's like 18 references to the word, and most of them occur in the Essay on Science as a Vocation. And then he like retconned them into the second edition of the Protestant Ethic. So, but like the analysis doesn't quite get together because he hadn't quite been able to sort of put it all together from. Ben was always tinkering. He's like Lucas, right? He's always like doing another version, like what things look like. So, but Weber's actual argument about the disenchantment of the world is that disenchantment means that we've eliminated, or we've purported to eliminate mysterious, incalculable forces. Everything's been now reduced to calculation and rational manipulation. We've therefore banished intrinsic moral meaning from the physical world, and by extension from the empirical. So Weber argues this is a huge cultural shift that happens, and I would argue happens not globally, but happens within a particular version of the European Enlightenment philosophical tradition. This is not something that happens all over the place. It happens within this particular tradition. And then we no longer have inherent meaning to reach to. It changes the very status of what ethics is. It changes how we think about moral questions, because you can no longer say, oh, what is the role of this in the great chain of being that goes all the way up to God? You don't have that. So you're like, what do I do now, right? So those are existential moments, the things that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were kind of picking up on, talking about existential dilemmas, are part of this disenchantment of the world. I mean, lose that inherent moral concept. The person I think who actually gets this in the contemporary academy, in the contemporary academy who gets this the best is Charles Taylor. And I think Taylor's approach, particularly in this book, The Secular Age, is to point out that really what we're talking about here is we're talking about a hostility to the transcendent, a particular way of thinking about facts as being immanent and knowledge as being purely immanent, and the disillusion of this inherently meaningful cosmos in favor of an indifferent universe, and then trying to figure out sort of what happens within it. The other point that Taylor makes that's super important is disenchantment doesn't mean that everybody is disenchanted. Disenchantment means that every mode of knowing and being has to engage disenchantment in some way, because you know that lurking right out there is a reasonably coherent and effective way of working and being in the world and manipulating the world that doesn't make reference to God, transcendental truth, divinity, metaphysics, etc. Right? So you know it's there. How do you engage that? So we might, to pun on Kant a little bit, refer to disenchantment as the kind of anti-transcendence imperative. If you see transcendence, you should get rid of it. And if you don't get rid of it simply by banishing it, you should explain it away. This is the typical gesture that you find in science fiction. This is why science fiction is sort of the literature of disenchantment in a lot of ways. Star Trek, which we'll hear more about later on today, because we're ecumenical, as Dan said last night, and we're going to actually put Star Trek into our Star Wars conference. Like Star Trek, every time God shows up or every time a divinity shows up, it turns out to be either a mad supercomputer or a super powerful alien or something else that's got a naturalistic explanation behind it, right? It can't actually be God. Because if you actually have divinity, it's like no longer science fiction. Now you're saying there's knowledge that can't be captured by immanence, right? So that anti-transcendence imperative is kind of the impetus of the project of disenchantment. This is a gesture. This is not an empirical characterization of anything. This is where people who do secularism get this wrong. Weber did not actually say the world is now disenchanted. Weber said disenchantment is a thing, and now everybody has to kind of deal with it. People forget, with the secular folks who are doing this sort of analysis of secularism, tend to forget that the last third of Weber's Science and Vocation essay is about religion, and about what religion does in a world characterized by disenchantment, a world where disenchantment shows up as an option. Again, very similar to what Taylor does when you're talking about secularism as an option. It changes even religious belief. So again, the point is engagement with disenchantment, not disenchantment versus not disenchantment. Why that's important is because, oh, look, another 2x2. There's a way in which we can think about engagements with disenchantment. I think is going to help us locate what Star Wars is doing. And I think the first question when it comes to engagements of disenchantment is, how does the particular kind of engagement regard the disenchanted world as disclosed by these questions of science? Is the disenchanted world autonomous and complete in its own on its own terms, or is it not autonomous, incomplete, needs to be supplemented by something else? The second question is whether the folks engaging with disenchantment or different engagement with disenchantment agree that disenchantment banishes meaning from the world. There are approaches that would say, no, actually, disenchantment is not meaningless. There's a meaning that can be found in the very process of disenchantment itself. The splintering, the fracturing of illusions, and sort of getting rid of false notions so that you can have something that's actually kind of true and real. So if we put these things together, right, the meaningful notion that disenchantment can actually be meaningful and that the disenchanted world is autonomous and complete itself gives us a kind of crusade against illusion, which you find, as I said, in science fiction. You find in a lot of European and American colonial projects of going to take indigenous knowledges and coding them as like, oh, you think it's the magic power of the willow tree. We think it's something we can exploit and turn into acid. So it's that kind of like, no, there's a real explanation down here and get to the real one. And that's a meaningful thing to do because we're getting in touch with what actual reality is. So that's that kind of engagement. There's a kind of engagement with disenchantment that says, no, science is actually not an inherently meaningless practice and is actually meaningful, but the world that's disclosed by science is kind of incomplete and it needs to be supplemented with various things. You find this in a lot of work on new materialisms, pluralisms, a lot of indigenous cosmology work where it's like, oh yeah, so these are actually knowledge of things, just not knowledge that's within this little box of what we call Western science. And so we can supplement this and move out in a different kind of direction. So a different kind of engagement with disenchantment. Star Wars is neither of those two, right? Star Wars is not crusading against illusion. The illusion that gets crusaded against in Star Wars is the force is not real illusion, because the narrative again and again reminds us and shows us concretely that the force is real, the Jedi are real. Han Solo's journey from being the skeptic on the Millennium Falcon in episode 4 to the person in episode 7 who's giving like the "it's all real" speech, like that's an important piece of the trajectory. So there are approaches that I think this is going to help us sort of understand what Star Wars is doing, that actually would say, no, we buy the idea that the disenchanted world is meaningless and raises problems for questions of meaning. So one way you can do this is say, yes, science discloses a kind of meaningless world of pure immanence that doesn't have any intrinsic meaning to it, but there's another way of disclosing things, which is separate. And we can talk about the separation between them. And then the dilemma for us is, how do we get sort of suspended between these two? The inherently meaningful, the moral cosmology world, and the indifferent world of chance and immanence. This turns out to be something that philosophers of religion have been investigating a lot in the last several decades. There is an approach to religious faith called fictionalism that I think nicely picks this up. The idea of saying, all right, religious belief can still be morally meaningful, even if we say none of these facts that are being put out are actually factual, which is kind of cool because it means you can keep Jesus and vaccines same time. You don't have to choose one or the other, which you do in this fourth place, which is the thing that Weber called the sacrifice of the intellect, or sometimes in the literature, and in philosophy of science literature, philosophy of religion literature, is referred to as the God of the gaps notion. The idea that science shows you something and it's inherently meaningless, but it's sort of not complete. It has to be supplemented by some transcendent principle that makes it all possible. So that's the Big Bang was actually like God waggling his finger, and that's why we have spread. Or you can actually see a lot of this stuff in traditional nationalist discourses, right? So here is this inherently meaningless world of science, but the only reason we've been able to discover it is because of the inherent national greatness of us, right? So the transcendent principle that comes in is this national identity notion. And then that allows us to engage. Again, all of these have their characteristic challenges that they sort of run into. But the point I want to draw from this in terms of thinking about Star Wars is that these on the top are engaged in what in the last book I wrote, I referred to as the factic discourse of science, right? Which is really kind of confining knowledge to these questions of descriptive claims that cannot be meaningfully disagreed with by competent speakers of a relevant language. So that would be kind of what it restricts to. And science fiction fits very much up in there. It's got to have physics, even if it's fake physics, and it's got to be consistent. And physicists can debate it and so on and so they can do that. Nobody actually debates how the hyperdrive and the Millennium Falcon works. It rarely does, except when the narrative requires it to. But also, what's interesting about the hyperdrive and the Millennium Falcon is not its tech. What's interesting about the hyperdrive and the Millennium Falcon is kind of it's part of this weird universe that gets explored in various ways, right? So that's all you need. You don't need the kind of elaborate physics, fake physics kind of apparatus that you get in most science fiction. Because everything down here on the bottom is what I'm going to call a mythic world disclosing discourse. It's either the sort of thing you get in a lot of nationalist or God of the gaps kinds of approaches, or it's this notion of here is a separate sphere that is complementary to the meaningless factic world that is disclosed by science. And I think Star Wars kind of lives down here. And spoiler alert, Star Wars lives in the lower left-hand corner because it explicitly presents the most genius move Lucas made is the opening crawl of the original episode 4. Before the crawl, there's a little message that flashes on the screen. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And the original text of that actually said, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, an incredible adventure took place, which makes it even not as good. So fortunately, Lucas has many talents, dialogue, not one of them. Very good that somebody actually got him to cut that second part out. But again, you can see with that, the real, like, this is really the opening of a fairy tale, right? It's the standard a long time ago, right? The standard kind of displacement that happened. Saying that means, okay, you're now entering fantasy. And I think that's a really important gesture that sort of sets Star Wars up as being. So Star Wars: A Magical World. This is actually a piece that I had commissioned as a Christmas present for my wife one year. Uzuri was the artist who produced it. What I said there is I wanted something that would give you the parallelism of the two lightsaber exchange moments between Luke and Rey that happen in episodes 8 and 9. And she came up with this, which she called Parallels, and I think that's a marvelous title to the thing. So Star Wars: A Magical World, right? What does it mean in Star Wars: A Magical World? Well, the rule number 1 of writing something or doing something in Star Wars universe, the Force is a real thing. Everybody who's a skeptic turns out to get disproven that the Force is a real thing. And if you don't think the Force is a real thing, then you get in trouble. Characters who doubt come to believe. Even someone, and I'll talk about this Andor just in a second here, but even someone like Cassian, who's like a professional skeptic, comes up to the edge of belief over the course of both Andor and then in Rogue One in particular. Rogue One being, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most profound movies about faith I've ever seen. It's a brilliant film. So everybody who doubts sort of ends up coming into belief over the course of the narrative. And the Force that shows up in the Star Wars universe is not a technology. It's not simply something you can use to manipulate the world. It's only the Sith that think you can quantify the Force by turning it into your midi-chlorian count. And that's a little bit unclear in parts of the prequels, but if you go back into the High Republic novels, and then if you go forward into The Mandalorian, you see what they've done very effectively is only bad guys actually use this midi-chlorian technology. And in The Mandalorian in particular, right, why do they want Grogu? Right? They want Grogu because they want his blood so they can like breed Force-sensitive soldiers and things. And it turns out that you can't do that, right? You can't do that because the Force doesn't work that way. So this idea that you can turn the Force into something that's rationally calculable turns out to be bad in the course of the narrative. You can't do that. Han Solo's famous line in episode 4, where he says, it's all simple tricks and nonsense. I call it luck. And Obi-Wan turns to him and says, in my experience, there's no such thing as luck. Remember that line? That's going to be really important when I talk about Andor in just a second. But this idea that because you live in an ordered cosmos, there can't be such thing as luck. There can't just be chance. Instead of chance, there has to be at some level kind of the will of the Force, at least as a sort of outline for things. Even if there's like random variation that happens or room for individual action, because as Obi-Wan says, the Force controls your actions, but it also partially obeys your commands. So it's a sort of interesting doubleness. But there is still this kind of throughput of the Force that runs through the saga as a whole. And the Force, as we hear over and over again, does not seek dominion. The Force seeks balance. The Force always seeks balance. And the examples you get in the Star Wars saga of someone, anyone moving off the balance, then the Force ends up coming back and sort of defeating them, destroying them, maneuvering somebody in a position to get rid of them, right? Luke ends up defeating Vader and Palpatine, asterisk, because of the whole stuff that happens with Palpatine actually coming back in Rise of Skywalker. But that whole thing that happens at the end of Return of the Jedi is precisely because Luke doesn't kill Vader. Because if Luke had killed Vader, well, that completes his journey to the dark side. He becomes sort of entrenched by Palpatine, and then he becomes Dark Luke and all that. And we already knew Luke was halfway there because he's dressed in black. So the whole color coding thing and remember at the beginning of Jedi when he's going into Jabba's palace, he does the Force choke. The only good character we ever see doing a Force choke, which is really interesting that he's sort of like in that like not quite like pure Jedi area. But his defeat of them comes because he doesn't kill Vader. Instead, he pulls back. He wins by not fighting, which is an incredibly kind of like Taoist way of thinking about this. We see, of course, Palpatine's whole plan is the Jedi Order gets corrupted. How do they get corrupted? They get corrupted because they get impressed with military service and they have to start fighting on the side of the right. And so they're fighting, and the fighting is what ends up really undermining and destroying the Jedi Order. From the High Republic novels, you see this is actually an older thing that's been going on. Sort of this has been like growing in the Jedi Order for hundreds of years. Palpatine kind of figures this out, exploits it, and is able to use it. But that's really what sort of corrupts them, because it's like the Jedi, in the Jedi case, it's, oh no, we're on the right. We have to do great things in defense of the right. And so we're going to end up just imposing stuff. This makes them blind to the growing power of the Sith anyway. They can't sense Palpatine. They don't even know they got a Sith Lord like down the street. So there's a whole tragedy of getting off of the balance one way or another. Now, Andor is an interesting entry into the Star Wars franchise, precisely because in its initial presentation, Andor appears to reject most of the mythical, right? Most of the world that you see, particularly through season 1 of Andor, is not a magical world characterized by a clear moral ontology. Instead, what you see is a lot of ethical ambiguity. You have characters with different motivations that are coming in and joining the rebellion. You have Luthen's whole thing about the awful things he has to do, including his very strong threat / manipulation to keep Lonnie on the council for the ISB so that, you know, gee, how's your kid, right? I mean, this is not the sort of thing we expect good guys normally to say. This is a threat, right? So there's a lot of moral ambiguity. And I think that's important because the Force is actually never mentioned on screen in the first season. There's no Force using characters, right? No one uses the Force. No one seems to be in touch with this. No one seems to be in touch with, this is where it's weird, no one seems to be in touch with what we as viewers who've seen other parts of the Star Wars franchise already know to be true in the terms of the world itself. We know the Force is real, we know the Force exists, but it's not mentioned, which is just fascinating. Right? No Force using characters. There's no mention of the Force until the episode immediately preceding the two we watched last night in Andor episode 7 of season 2, in which Cassian, having a blaster burn that won't heal, gets taken. Bix kind of drags him to see a Force healer. And the Force healer heals him and also makes a bit of a prophecy about Cassian being a messenger and him needing to be someplace. And of course, for all of us who are knowledgeable of Saga, we're like, oh, we know exactly where he has to be. We know exactly what message it is he has to be bringing. So we're all clear about that. And if you listen carefully to the musical cues in that episode, they start the Force theme. The sort of stand the one sometimes Obi-Wan sings, but then they cut it. So it starts, and then when Cassian is skeptical, it cuts it. It's like, oh, okay. So they're like inching toward it and then backing off of it, which is just absolutely fantastic. Where I expected to see an earlier mention of the Force was in Nemik's Manifesto. I expected, being someone who was primed with thinking about this in Star Wars world, that when we got to the presentation of Nemik's actual manifesto, there'd be at least some glancing reference to the Force. And there wasn't. And instead you get, I don't like this line. Freedom is a pure idea that occurs spontaneously. I'm like, what is that? No. If that had just said, freedom is a pure idea that arises from the Force. Okay, that's all that would have taken. That's all it would have taken to sort of tie it in. Now, we can debate production decisions and so on, but I do think it's great that Andor did eventually sort of close that circle and come back in the stuff that happens at the end of the second season. So you do actually have things being pulled back in. As we saw in the episodes last night, you have both Luthen and, oh man, autocorrect made him Luther. Ignore that. Imagine I actually wrote Luthen. I kept wanting to change Bix too to Big, and I'm like, no. But Luthen and Bix both suggest that Cassian has a destiny, that there's something kind of magical about him showing up in the places that he shows up. And if you are reading this through the lens of the whole Star Wars world, then like, what is that except the Force, right? That there is something kind of going on here that's bringing you. Because we know Cassian has a purpose. And we know the purpose that Cassian has is not to single-handedly defeat the Empire and win, but we know Cassian has a particular role to play that comes together in a contingent way of all the various people that he's connected with and so on, all the stuff that happens in Rogue One. We kind of know where this is going. So in that sense, this, I think, links Andor ultimately back into this question. Andor is a story about rebellion and what happens in rebellion under authoritarian or fascist regimes, but it's also a story about resistance to evil, because we know that the Empire is not just bad and oppressive and limiting freedoms and so on. We also know it's ruled by an evil symbol, right? So that there is this background kind of metaphysical argument going on. Now, and I said I was only going to talk briefly about this last point. This is the Prime Jedi. This shows up in the reflecting pool that Luke is sitting in front of in Last Jedi on Ahch-To, when he's looking at he's sort of giving the story of like how the Jedi Order failed. This is the thing that's sort of sitting there in the pool. The Taoist resonance should not surprise anyone who has done any kind of dive into the overarching philosophy of Star Wars. The whole, I mean, what is that except a yin yang, right? That's exactly, I gotta get the dots and everything, right? That's clearly what they're pulling. So if the Force is about balance and Star Wars is about the Force, I mean, Star Wars is about balance. And in the context of it being an American fairy tale, this means it is a debate with what Anders Stephenson once called a matrix for interpreting space and time in America, which is manifest destiny. Right? The idea that the United States had a unique God-given role to play in the world, and therefore that justified a whole lot of stuff, including relative separation from the European balance of power system, its concentration of large military, its elimination of all of the indigenous tribes to the West, that all of this was about somehow fulfilling this grand plan. And this notion, this manifest destiny notion, is present in every American foreign policy articulation. Pick one at random and you can find it. This is a non-locally distributed frame that you find everywhere. When Dan Nexon and I first noticed this, when we were writing this piece on the board of American foreign policy a number of years ago, we looked at every presidential inaugural address. And every inaugural address says exactly the same thing about the chosenness of the United States and its important function. Or where they differ is, do we do this by force, by imposing stuff on the rest of the world? Or do we do it by closing down and becoming the city on the hill exemplar that attracts the rest of the world? Or some combination of the two, right? That's the sort of matrix of US foreign policy. And I am counting the westward expansion of the genocide of the indigenous tribes as part of foreign policy, because it's an encounter with others, right? It's an encounter with others over boundaries, and in particular, you're not so we're going to eliminate you. Star Wars is dialoguing with this. Star Wars is critiquing this, right? Manifest Destiny has been around since before the beginning. You find it in the Federalist Papers. You find this in sort of early colonial documents where they're talking about independence. Why does the United States have to be, why the colonies have to be independent of Britain? Well, part of it is because we got to play our role, right? The Puritans that settle in New England are sort of bringing this notion to begin with, like we need to get out of England because we can be the pure place that reflects God, right? So look at this wonderful empty land, empty asterisk, that God has created for us. And you even get it, frankly, you get it in justifications of slavery as well. Look at the peoples that the Lord has placed before us that we can bring over to do all the hard work, right? So this all becomes like part of this theologically inspired plan. And this has animated the United States for 250 years, right? We're at the celebration here. Celebration. So, right, this has been around, and I think Star Wars is a very interesting critique of this. Biographically, we know don't know if everybody knows this. The film Lucas was actually working on before he did Star Wars. So Lucas had developed a version of Apocalypse Now and was going to do that. And for him, it was going to be more of a dark comedy than what Coppola ended up ultimately doing with it. But he was really interested in this because he wanted to critique and demonstrate the problems of some of what was going on in U.S. foreign policy, particularly in Vietnam. And boy, Apocalypse Now, you can sort of see sort of what it is that they're trying to accomplish with that. And so Lucas is sort of doing this, and when that didn't pan out, because Lucas can never finish a script, then he ended up sort of pivoting over to do the Flash Gordon thing that he had in mind, which became Star Wars. So we have this engagement with this notion of chosenness, because what Star Wars says again and again and again, through multiple characters, through multiple situations, through multiple plots and subplots, is that thinking that you are uniquely chosen by the universe to fulfill some manifest destiny is a bad thing. Don't do that. Choose instead balance. Even though balance is kind of a morally harder road because you don't get the justification of fighting in defense of the right. Instead, you have something that's much more tenuous. You see the Jedi that are held up as good in the course of the narrative are always saying this. Qui-Gon's line in episode 1, I can protect you, but I can't fight a war for you, right, is a sort of early indication of this. Again, I've already mentioned Luke standing back and not actually striking a killing blow. At the end of Rise of Skywalker, even, right? How does Rey end up winning? Rey ends up winning by defending. It's not about attack, it's about I'm defending against. So it's this take a stance and hold the space. In a way, this is a very un-American kind of approach to politics and international relations in particular. And it is that un-Americanness or that critical of Americans that I think is what Star Wars says. And what I think Star Wars says that is relevant to at least thinking about politics.
Can we take 10 minutes for
Take 10
questions?
minutes? Yeah, sounds good. I know it was a lot for early in the morning. But I also have to say, thank you very much for the opportunity to spell out the book, because as I've been working through, you know how you work on a book and you kind of have a sense of what the whole is supposed to look like, but it's hard to make all the pieces come together. And being kind of forced in a good way to have to articulate the whole thing is actually incredibly helpful. So I don't know what that did for you, but it helped me.
And that way of ordering the discourse also, that when you intervene with this myth this way, you're doing this kind of work versus that kind of work versus, right, which I think, right, one of the problems we have when we're doing sort of interdisciplinary conventions, right, we all use eclectic vocabularies. We're not always entirely clear on what sorts of interventions we're making, and these are, what the conflict people will tell us is that these discourses have different orders, right, and in social science, orders of discourse was really, Jack Donald told us how to do that in social science. But for conflict, we don't always quite know, right? So there's a service here that you're taking.
Yeah, and part of the interests in ordering different kinds of discourses and different kinds of intervention. I mean, one of the, I guess, twin strengths and weaknesses of my thinking about this stuff is I'm a real big fan of conceptual clarity, even over clarity. So producing ideal types. And then saying, acknowledging that actual discourses may be very muddled, maybe very mixed in terms of how these things actually kind of come together. Certainly there are readings of Star Wars that would not make it as clearly a mythic intervention as I've been sort of presenting it here. And that's fine. That's why we have a conference. That's why we have people who are sort of analyzing things in different kinds of ways, right? Because you can sort of see it. The claim I want to make is, again, not that one of the four is necessarily the best, but that we should realize that there are four and that they are different and that they have different kinds of requirements, different kinds of implications. They afford different kinds of interventions. They afford different ways of reading the politics of these things. And so, yeah, so part of what I always try to do with these things is provide a little bit of overview clarity of all right, so here's kind of what the landscape might look like in terms of this thing. So, So even if one doesn't buy the strong claim about Star Wars being a mythical response to Disenchantment all the way through, I still think there's value in the map. So, and I'm glad that you also think there's value in the map. So yeah, because that will be helpful when I publish the book.
There's no other questions, we can take a break, and
Have you thought about Epic? The Epic one, which is a sort of old. 'Cause
Yeah.
You hit a
Yeah.
long time ago in Galaxy Far Far Away.
Yeah.
Right, that feels like. Like the Homeric location,
Yeah.
right? And then the novel as the epic in the world. Right?
Yeah, no, I mean, Epic is certainly another kind of conceptual lens that one might read this through. The thing about Epic, though, is since the issue that I primarily want to get at is this disenchantment thing, you can have epics that are disenchanted, right? This is the whole genre of space opera, right? So this is the kind of thing that you get. And look, we have this big sprawling galaxy, but there's kind of fake physics that runs along with it. It's not really about. I mean, Babylon 5 actually does this, I think, better than Star Trek in some ways, because Babylon 5's transcendent things turn out to be time travel. And so it's like, oh, okay, cool. So it's people from the future, but it's also kind of naturalistically explained, right? But so you can have an epic, right? You can tell these kind of epic stories that way without sort of touching this thing there. Part of the reason I want to pick up on that too is because one of the things that you often find people commenting on, I think without necessarily pulling the full implications of it, are the aesthetics, the used universe aesthetic of Star Wars. Right. This is one of the things that Lucas and his people were very, very concerned to sort of establish with episode 4 and then continued all the way through. It looks like a world that's been lived in. Right. Stuff is not, if it's pristine, it's pristine because the bad guys are keeping it pristine. Everything else is messy and it's dirty. And like the Millennium Falcon is, as Luke says, right, what a piece of junk. It's a piece of junk. I mean, that's exactly it. But it turns out to be the fastest hunk of junk in the galaxy, as Lando says later. So that used universe aesthetic. One of the things that is, I mean, I said earlier that one of the things that maybe the most genius move is the sort of fairy tale setting move thing that comes before the opening crawl. The other thing that's genius is most fantasy, things we would think of as fantasy, tend to be set in lower levels of technological development. Right. So we put it back in medieval, we put it back in sort of Renaissance, even we put it back in like, okay, so they don't have computers. Star Wars is like, yeah, they have computers and droids are at least plausibly persons. And so it's like advanced technology. And usually that gets coupled in a genre sense with a kind of disenchanted world, the Star Trek version. Star Wars says, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to take these technological innovations and then we're going to wrap it in this kind of mythic thing. Vader's line in episode 4, don't be too proud of this technological terror you've constructed, in some ways is like Lucas's perpetual punchline in these things, like technology never saves you. So it's always something else. It's always this kind of return to balance, this return to the metaphysical world thing. And so all of it by way of saying that the notion of epic in some ways is not precise enough to give me that and highlight that dimension of the thing. And if I can be indulgently autobiographical for a second, part of this also stems from the fact that, when you're a 5-year-old kid and you're on a playground and everybody's seen Star Wars and you're debating Star Wars and all the boys want to be Han Solo and you're the guy who wants to be Luke, it's like, okay, no, I don't want to be Han Solo. I don't want to be the person flying the Millennium Falcon. Like, there was need, being able to fly the Millennium Falcon when you go to Galaxy's Edge is kind of cool, but like, that wasn't the ultimate wish fulfillment for me. The ultimate wish fulfillment for me was Savi's lightsaber workshop, where you build your own lightsaber and freaking Master Yoda comes on the speakers and says that you're strong in the Force. And I'm like, oh, I have arrived. Beautiful. That's the wish fulfillment moment for me, right? And on the Galactic Star Cruiser, there was a moment where if you followed the Saga Jedi path, you could get to a hologram of Yoda that, again, since they had Disney money behind it, looks exactly like a hologram of Master Yoda. Like you would swear that you're actually opening a hologram and seeing a hologram of Yoda. And Yoda telling all of us in the room that we were touched by the Force and had a role to play in defeating the First Order. I mean, every single person I talked to about that experience walked out of the room, A, in tears, and B, saying that was church. That was religion. I'm like, oh, okay, this is really getting at something here. So again, I don't think epic quite gives me that in a way that myth does. So. That might be a good place to stop.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was great.
Cool.